So welcome back to another one of our beginner tutorials. So I guess if you're here now, you've gone through all the basics. There's a chance you've painted the eye. And we want to have a look at the next part of just ramping up a little bit more detail, a little bit more texture, and painting this project. We're going to have a little bit of an inventory check. So I've got a texture stencil. These are from Art Tool, Texture FX. They're a great little tool, and you'll find you'll use them more and more. Downside is they're made out of a sort of like a cardboard. As long as you don't bend them, they tend to last quite a long time. Obviously the trusty scalpel, an eraser pencil, and this sort of I pick it up from a florist, and it's angel weave or spider's webbing, and it's basically when they arrange flowers or they make a bouquet, they wrap the flowers in them, so you've got this sort of nice pretty wrapping to it. And I found that I noticed that obviously I could see through it, so that meant I can paint through it, and it gives me really subtle texture, more so than this will, just because of how fine it is. So those are all the parts I'm going to be using. Obviously the airbrush, and I'm just going to be keeping to a single colour again. We're going to move you step by step through all the sort of details and textures, and when we've sort of completed this part of it, the next stage will be coming up and sort of adding colour to the painting, so you can start building full colour murals. So one of the first things we always do is break down the image. So I need to look for hard edges. Obviously we can see one all the way around the edge, so we can cut that out. But one of the first things is the black. Where I can see black, I'm going to cut out. The nose part of it, some of it's not black, so in the first step what I'm going to do is just cut out where I can see black. It'll make sense later on when you see what we're going to do. But for the first step of this, we're going to cut out every little bit of black, even between the teeth, these little parts, these little triangles. We're going to cut all those out because we want a shield to put them in, and this is going to be the ideal opportunity to add all that in first. And the reason being is once they're in, nothing's going to change. So once they're black, they're not going to get any blacker, or they're going to change with any of the overspray. So we can add those in, get them to the shape we want, and then we can carry on adding some of the details. So the first step is we're going to get the trusty scalpel again, and we're going to hit the cutting mat, and I'm just going to show you some of the parts I'm going to cut out so we can start to paint. Okay, so let's start to cut some of these black areas out. I need to sort of try and stay true to the reference as much as I can. If I stray a little bit, it's not the end of the world. But at the end of it, we as the artist, we always tend to compare to the reference at the end, and it is sort of at this point it'll be a little bit difficult to replicate it spot on. But in time, obviously your control is going to get better, and exercises like these are going to help you get to that goal that you need. Before you know it, those sort of daggers and those dots and everything else will be second nature. So as I mentioned in the first part, is I'm going to leave some of these areas which I can see are not black, and I'm just going to cut out the areas that are. Again, when we start to paint, it'll make a little bit more sense. So some of these little parts. obviously I'm going to move on to sort of these. There's a little bit of subtlety in this background there. It's not going to matter whether I leave that in or not. So I'm just going to take out the area that I see. Sometimes it's that subtle. I'm not going to say it's not worth bothering with, but it's not going to affect the picture really that much if I just take them out. And some for these parts, the one just between the teeth. This will help with, because they're so small, if we try and freehand some of these in, we can get that sort of softer look or edge to them, and we want to keep them quite sharp. Teeth are notoriously one of the most difficult things to paint, I've found, especially early days. Just because of the texture of them, they're just so different to everything else, especially when you're painting skulls. So we're going to sort of shield some of these in a little bit later. I'm going to make it really simple to get the effect. So I just find if you try and freehand some of these in, it just never looks like it's supposed to. And try and follow some of these areas as best as you can, especially in the teeth. The skull or the bone area we can get away with a little bit, mainly because of the texture that's there. But for these, the teeth, they're quite sharp, and if we sort of stray off a little bit or give them that 50p shape, they're not going to look right. We can always fix it with a little bit of erasing here and there, but just take your time with it. So I'm just cutting all the way around the edge. And again, trying to keep it as constant as I can, so I don't get that sort of 50p shape. So you can see there, if I turn it over, you can see there some of the parts that I've cut out. You can sort of start to make out what's there, and that'll be an ideal starting point for us. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a shape at the top, at the bottom, sorry, and the top. The reason being is so I can reach for a piece of tape and I'm just going to de-tack it slightly and just put it over the hole. And let's get back to our panel. Okay, so I've stuck it down just on the top and that bottom just to hold it in place. Now you can use either. We're going to start to block in some of these areas on the inside, but as we come to the outer edge, you can use the other cutout just to keep the overspray inside if you need to, just for the ease of the project. Just so I can show you what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start to airbrush just around the edge, keeping it nice and clean. Don't forget the technique, the airbrush stroke as such, and leave that. Don't get leaving that trigger open so we start to scrubbing with things like that. We want to keep it paint on, off, on, off. Just keep it, and it'll keep it nice and smooth. Now, like I say, you can keep, you don't have to do this at this step. If you just want the skull as it is, you can use the outer edge. Don't paint this part first. As we start to paint, we can piece in the outer edge and you can keep the overspray in to keep it clean. So for this next part, I'm just going to start blocking, same as we did with the eye, same as we did with the apple and that stalk. Just let it pass over, let it dry and let it build up. Keep the air on it if need be. And it's always best to try and keep your paint as thick as possible. We don't need that much for these areas, we don't need that much control with the airbrush. But if it covers in 1 or 2 passes, it's ideal and we can get on with the rest of the work. Also, we're going to be using this cutout we've made quite a lot throughout this painting. So if you notice, so far we haven't done a line drawing as such, so we haven't got a guide to follow. But what we're going to do for this one is we're going to let the reference guide us, so we don't need a line drawing for it. The cutouts and the planning for it should help us line everything up, and this is one of the important parts of this step. This will help us line back up the nose, line back up the parts in the eyes. If we need to line the teeth up, we've got the cutouts in between, so it'll help that as well. And obviously the outer edge that I've just painted around, that will help us line the skull up anyway. So this will work, this technique will work for any project really, but especially any sort of skull or custom project as such. But it doesn't have to be a skull. All I'm doing is we're sort of breaking it down just to help us build the project. This is not just sort of made simple for beginners. This is a way I would work anyway if it was a commission, or you know, someone wanted this type of thing painting. I would still work in exactly the same manner. I don't have any sort of other special techniques that I would use. So I just want to make sure that this is dry really before I start to remove anything. Okay, so you can see it's got all those parts in, nice and clean. I've got a nice little border around the edge. Again, remember this step around that edge, you don't have to. What we could do once that's in, if that's lined up, we need to piece this in to line up with the skull, and then as we start to work, we could take that out. Just make sure that's secured, and we'll keep all of our overspray just inside, so we won't get anything on the outside. So back on the cutting mat, I want to continue and cut out especially the rest of those parts that were in that nose, which are left in. And I'm just going to leave that bottom piece in. Just take out these parts, so you can see we've got the nose cut out fully. And so we ain't constantly bouncing backwards and forwards. What I'm going to do is, if I look at the eyes as well, I'm going to cut out those shape of the eyes, mainly just to help me keep the overspray on the inside. and we'll keep these just to one side because we might need them a little bit later on. So whenever I'm cutting a project apart like this, I never throw anything away until I've completed the painting. I never know what I'm going to need a little shield for, or that little particular cutout. So carefully line that back up, get that sort of back in, and obviously you can see now it's exposed these areas that we masked out in the first place in that nose. So if I go back to the reference, you can see some of them are a little bit lighter than others, and some of them are obviously pushed into that background, into that distance. So first I'm just going to start to use this little texture stencil, and I'm just going to lightly dust over and start to add. You can just see it's just starting to add that little bit of detail. What I tend to do is keep the shield moving just a touch, because it tends to have a little bit of a softer effect on it. And now looking at the reference, I can see it's a little bit lighter at that top, so I can start to darken down some of these edges. It's a lot darker in the middle. And just let those build up as and how you sort of see it in the reference. So there it's a little bit darker. These are just standard strokes. Just letting that build up. No real detail. I went a little bit closer there because I wanted it a little bit darker. But before I go any further, I'm just going to take this off, just so I can sort of see. Now on the inside of there you can see, obviously I've got a little bit of detail going on in there. I could have just blacked it in, but I find that these little pieces just add that little bit of extra to the painting. You can also see I've got this sort of little bit of overspray on that edge, so that's not a problem. I just want to make sure I can see that that's still a little bit wet. I can go in with the eraser and just clean up that edge. Let's pop our shield back in. And let's have a look at the eyes. So you can see from the cutout, we've got this sort of texture detail in there. So again, the texture stencil will be perfect for it. So it's up over onto this side, and I'm just going to lightly add that little piece in on that edge, and you can see it gives me that same very similar effect. So I'm just going to keep moving. I just want this nice and soft. Again at distance, I'm probably applying this with the airbrush around about 4 to 5 inches away, just to add that little bit of background noise, and so it doesn't look so flat. So one of the things I actually forgot to mention in the first part is obviously a piece of paper. So all I've done is I've just torn an edge off a piece of paper. So anything you've got lying around, any sort of old papers or whatever, they'll do. But what we tend to get is this uneven edge. And it's perfect for projects like this because I want to, as that just looks like a block of black, I'm just going to shield off that top and use this in the same manner I would any other shield. And just add that little piece of shading onto it, because now it looks like that this piece there just goes on the inside. So I just want to shadow that a little bit. And for some of these around this area, they've also got a little bit of shape to them as well. So just off that edge and looking at where the pieces are, just so it starts to look a little bit 3D. So I'm just extending the shapes off. If I shadow that little edge there, it looks like it's going inside, and it just gives it that little bit more sort of depth to it. Also, we've got a lot of these sort of dots. So if we go to our other print, you can see some of these darker sort of pieces there. So this is where we can go in. We can just start to add the dot as we practiced in the early parts. Some of them are a little bit bigger and softer, and just add some of those sort of dots in the background. If you're struggling with those still, what we can do is go for a cocktail stick, and in the piece of paper we can just put a little hole. Obviously the further you push the stick through, you get that sort of little bigger hole, and we can use that just to spray through and get the same effect and keep it nice and clean. So I'm going to drop over and do this side as well before I go any further. So remember, nice and light, just add some of this texture into the background. And I'm going to just have a quick look at the reference, and I've got a little edge off this part just to make that look as though it's sort of coming, this part's coming forward and that piece is going sort of inside. I'll just stretch this one as well a little bit and just add some of these little dots just for that extra little bit of detail. So if we look at the reference again now, this is more or less the background noise that's there. So if we look at the reference and look at the shadow in the eye as it comes down, it gets lighter. So obviously that's sort of like a blend stroke. So if we started at the top and sort of angled downwards, we could get that natural blend that we've got inside that eye. So for this point, let me just zoom out so you can see the angle I'm working. So I'm just going to angle down slightly. You should be able to see the angle of the airbrush. And I'm just going to start to apply that stroke. And let that drift down. Obviously it's a lot darker at the top. We don't want to be too black, so we can use the reference of how dark it is there just to make sure that we don't go too dark. I'm just going to drift over the rest of it because obviously in the reference it's not white. And the same this side. Just let that dry. Just let that natural blend. I'm just going to tint over that area. Okay, let's take off the shield and let's have a look. So you can see at that point what I want to be able to feel like I can put my hands in there. So that blend stroke has added that little bit of depth and obviously giving you that sort of the feeling that it's inside. So that's perfect for us. Again, if you've picked up a little bit of overspray, but that doesn't matter. These bottom edges really are the sharpest part on the reference, but it's quite soft around these edges. And to sort of help with that as well, one of the things I'm going to do at this point now is just a standard stroke. So if I look at it from this angle, around about 3.5 inches away, nice light stroke, and I just want to hit the edge, just to give it that rounded sort of feel, that rounded look. Not too dark, but just to cast that sort of, giving it that shadow that it's just hanging over. It's time to go back to the cutting mat. So again, just so I know where I'm going to be cutting, what I'm looking for is hard edges. So I can see this temple area. So I'm going to keep that cut, but I've left it attached there mainly, so just in case if I need this afterwards, I can just fold that back, which will let me sort of paint up to that edge, and I'm going to do the same the other side. Just fold that back. So one of the next parts is we may as well cut just underneath so we can separate the bottom jaw and the sort of cheekbone area, so we can keep those separate as well. We can make a cut. I've got a sharp edge along this side there. Again, you notice I've left around about 1 centimetre there, mainly so I can just fold that back and I can use that edge as well. Okay, so this now should start to give our skull some real shape and start to give it a little bit of form. Okay, so in the reference, it's rather than just, I can see a sort of like a direction going back up this way rather than just shading it in. So I'm going to use that to my advantage and just start to shade, again, only a distance, just start to add those strokes in that same direction. This will help me get a little bit of shape to it. Be careful where we've got this fold here. I don't want a line there, so I'm just trying to keep away from that edge the best I can. And the same the other side. Around about 3 inches away, nice and soft, not doing any sort of detail work. And before we remove the shield, I'm just going to fold that edge back and just lightly paint a blend stroke, just going down around about sort of to 1 inch, just under that bottom edge. And we'll get the same this side as well. Okay, let's pop off the shield and let's have a look. So you can see there that it's given me the shape of the eyes, and it's also given me sort of a shape to the head as well. So what I want to do at that point now is just continue those on. So we've got a little bit of a shadow which I can just paint onto, again at distance. You can see I'm probably around about 4 to 5 inches away at this point. Just to soften up that edge, and I'm just going to paint just around that back edge with a nice soft stroke, just to give us that rounded part of it. So for this next part, same as we did with inside the eyes, we've got these little sort of potholes or marks and little dots inside the sort of the bone area. So we're going to add those in first. And the reason I always add them in first is mainly because if I don't like one, I can take it away, I can get rid of it. So I'm just going to start to add some of these dots. Left the trigger open a touch there. And like I say, if I don't like one, because there's no other shading around it, I can just get rid and add it in again. Don't forget, you can always still use the little sort of hole, the little dot. I can reshape those just to make them a dot again, and just add in those little details. So it looks a little odd at the minute, but it'll all make sense. As soon as we start to add some of that detailing and some of that texture, it'll all start to play together. We're going to add some little highlights to these as well, just to make them stand out and look a little bit 3D. So now I want to reach for this material I mentioned earlier, because if we look again, let's go back to the reference, we see this sort of mottle effect, which is going to be really difficult to create with the airbrush just by itself. So I find that this stuff works perfect. So I've got to be careful, because if I'm too close, I'm still going to get a line and it's going to be a little bit too heavy. So I need to make sure my distance is there, just so you can start to see. So it's always best to work a little bit lighter. We can always add more, just to add that little bit of effect over the top. So I'm going to continue just to add this lightly over the sort of the whole forehead area. A little bit like we did with the texture stencil to start with, but just to give it that little bit more texture around the area, because again in the reference it's not white, so I'm just at distance, probably around about 6 to 8 inches away now. I'm just going to lightly pass just over the top, just to take that edge off that white. So if we look at the reference off these little sort of noggins at the top there, we've got a little bit of, I'm seeing like a blend stroke, and also one just on the inside here as well. So coming in at an angle from this angle, I'm just going to lightly start to add that little bit of a blend stroke in, and the same just on the inside there, just to give that little bit of shape. I'm going to do the same from this side, just angling in just a touch and just off that top edge. So be careful not to get too close. Obviously too close we're going to get a line, and that's not what we're looking for. So back to the cutting mat, and we've got this sort of bridge of the nose area there, which I'm just going to cut out, just a single cut. I want to try and follow it as best as I can. It's quite uneven, and just make that single cut. The idea behind it is once that's cut, if we just pull that apart just a touch, you can see it's giving us that gap, and that'll help us paint in that line exactly where it needs to be. Nice and light. I don't want it to be too dark, just to add in that line. Now, using my little bit of a torn paper, maybe I can just extend that down off the edge where it needs to. Again, the torn paper is perfect for it because it's so sort of uneven. And where I've got that line, I don't want to be too close, but I just want to soften it slightly with a stroke over the top. Which will give it that sort of rounded look, so it looks like a proper join. And also in the reference there's some little sort of detail marks. So on the line I'm just going to start to add some little marks and dots. Just to give it that that little bit more of a realistic look. Now I've got those in place, I can start to look at how light or how dark it is in that point. So I can, one of the things we haven't covered yet is I can use my finger just to paint off the edge, just nice and light. If I start to drift that in, you can start to see it giving me a soft edge, mainly because your finger's rounded, and obviously you can see it's starting to keep the bridge of that nose clean. And as that sort of stretches down, we can see it's nice and dark here and here, so that's lighter there. So I'm going to add that little sort of stroke into there. Again, at distance, it doesn't need to be detailed or in any way sort of any strokes there. I'm just going to darken up this point here. Again, nice soft strokes, they're not detailed strokes as such. And that's, you can see just by doing that, it's given it a sort of brought it forward and lifted it up. So I'm going to use the blade just for a second. I'm just going to zoom in now just to show you. I'm just going to add, just underneath that bottom of each of these little dots, I'm just going to add a little highlight. Just so you can see that it sort of gives it that 3D realistic sort of indent, so you can, it looks as though they are holes rather than just being a dot. So you don't have to do all of them, it just depends on how many you've done. But we needed to make sure we'd got paint there first before we started to take them out, else we wouldn't see these sort of highlighted marks. So there is a few sort of just in there as well. And just lightly with the eraser, there's a couple of sort of highlighted sort of parts just on the bridge of that. On the bridge of that nose.